For decades, the world ran on a simple assumption. American economic leadership was a fact of life, as constant as the tides. The global trade system, for all its complexities, seemed to orbit a single, unshakable center of gravity. But what if, in an attempt to reinforce that very dominance, America accidentally triggered its own eclipse? What if the plan to bring a rival to its knees ended up giving it the tools to build an empire? Here's a number that should do more than just keep you up at night. It should force a fundamental rethink of global power. Since 2018, a year that was supposed to mark the beginning of China's economic containment, Beijing's share of global manufacturing exports hasn't just grown, it has skyrocketed to over 30%. Let that sink in. That's not just more than the United States, it's more than the US, Germany, and Japan, the next three largest manufacturing exporters combined. In just a few short years, the world's factory became the world's indispensable supplier, turning a trade war into a staggering $7 trillion global supply chain empire. And it happened while America, the architect of the post-war global order, completely fumbled the ball. This isn't a story about China's inevitable rise, it's the story of a great miscalculation. I want to break down exactly how the Trump administration's signature tariff policy, a policy designed to cripple China's economy and force it to the negotiating table, did the exact opposite. We'll explore how it turbocharged Beijing's global ambitions, handed it unprecedented economic leverage over the entire planet, and in a stroke of geopolitical irony, pushed America's own allies straight into China's waiting arms. The story of this tariff boomerang is crazier and far more consequential than you could possibly imagine. So, let's rewind. After Trump's second inauguration, the America First doctrine went into overdrive. The administration, convinced that decades of free trade had hollowed out the American heartland, unleashed its ultimate weapon, a massive, unilateral tariff offensive. Citing Section 301 of the Trade Act, the U.S. dropped punishing taxes on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods. We're talking everything from high-tech electronics and industrial machinery to everyday consumer goods, with some tariffs soaring as high as 100% on strategic items like steel and aluminum. The stated goal was simple and brutal: inflict enough economic pain to force China to concede on intellectual property theft, force technology transfers, and the massive trade deficit. The White House envisioned a humbled Beijing suing for peace. But they made two critical miscalculations. First, they underestimated China's willingness to absorb pain and retaliate. Beijing didn't blink. It immediately fired back with its own tariffs, strategically targeting American agricultural exports like soybeans and pork, products sourced from the very heart of Trump's political base. It was a calculated move to inflict maximum political pain. The second miscalculation was even more damaging. Here's the twist that turned the whole strategy on its head. Instead of shrinking, China's export machine went into hyperdrive. Faced with a deadline before the tariffs kicked in, Chinese factories worked 24/7. They chartered every available ship, flooding U.S. ports and warehouses with an unprecedented volume of goods. Economists call this front-loading. American companies, desperate to stock up before prices skyrocketed, bought everything they could. The result? A massive artificial surge that injected billions in cash into Chinese companies right before the trade war began in earnest. It also created an enormous inventory glut inside the U.S., which depressed domestic prices and delayed any intended effect of the tariffs for months, even years. The first shot in the trade war wasn't a blow to China, it was a self-inflicted wound, a chaotic scramble that backfired hard. But that was just the opening act. The real lasting damage came when America's economic nationalism bled into its foreign policy. The administration began a systematic retreat from the very global institutions it had built. The most symbolic move was pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. This wasn't just any trade deal, it was a strategic US-led alliance designed explicitly to create a trading bloc that could set the rules of commerce in Asia and counterbalance China's growing influence. By walking away, the US didn't just abandon the deal, it abandoned its allies and created a massive power vacuum. At the same time, driven by a desire to cut costs, the administration started slashing its own soft power. Budgets for foreign aid programs like USAID were axed. These programs weren't just charity, they were diplomatic lifelines, fostering goodwill and maintaining American influence in developing nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. As America cut lifelines, China swept in with a checkbook. With the US retreating, Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative went from an ambitious proposal to the undisputed main event in global development. While Washington was building tariff walls, Beijing was building literal bridges, roads, ports, and railways for the very countries America had left behind. They weren't just offering loans, they were offering a comprehensive vision of state-led development, a tempting alternative to the Western model. Critics in the West called it debt-trap diplomacy, arguing that China was deliberately burdening poor countries with unsustainable loans to seize strategic assets when they defaulted. But for nations desperate for infrastructure, it was a deal they couldn't refuse. China wasn't just gaining trade partners, it was methodically buying influence, securing access to critical resources, and locking down entire regions into its economic orbit. The vacuum left by the TPP and USAID became China's playground, but perhaps the most devastating boomerang effect was the one that struck America's own technological future. Then came the big, beautiful bill that was sold as a fiscally responsible move to trim the deficit, a complete gutting of federal subsidies for U.S. electric vehicles and green technology. The logic was that the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers, and that the market should decide. The Inflation Reduction Act, which had kick-started a renaissance in American green manufacturing, was rolled back. Overnight, the calculus for American industry was turned upside down. The price of a US-made EV shot up for consumers. Ford, which had committed billions to new battery plants in Michigan and Tennessee, scrambled. GM, which had bet its future on its Ultium battery platform, saw its plans thrown into chaos. They were forced to halt expansions and lay off thousands of workers. While American automakers were reeling, China's state-subsidized champions thrived. Companies like BYD, already a giant, saw a golden opportunity. Pumped up by massive state support and a protected, booming domestic market, they didn't just dominate at home, they launched a global export blitz, flooding markets in Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America with high-quality, affordable EVs. American innovation in a key 21st century industry stalled, not because of a lack of ingenuity, but because of a deliberate policy choice. This pattern repeated in semiconductors. U.S. export controls, meant to cripple China's chip industry, instead triggered a furious state-funded push for self-sufficiency. Companies like SMIC, once seen as second-tier, were showered with billions in government investment. While they still lag at the highest end, they rapidly closed the gap in mature chip technologies, securing China's supply chain against American pressure. The message sent to the world's top talent was clear. America was becoming a volatile place for future-focused industries, while China was signaling unwavering long-term commitment. The result was a quiet but critical brain drain, as top engineers and scientists, seeing their projects defunded in the US, began looking to the east where the investment was flowing. So the tariff boomerang came back, but it wasn't the same object that was thrown. It returned heavier, faster, and far more dangerous. An attempt to reset the terms of trade ended up accelerating America's own relative decline. It created a short-term economic mess through front-loading, opened a geopolitical vacuum that China masterfully filled with its Belt and Road Initiative, and sabotaged America's own leadership in the key technologies of the future. This wasn't just a policy failure, it was a paradigm-shifting event that we will be grappling with for decades. Was this an avoidable series of self-inflicted wounds, or the inevitable result of a rising power meeting a declining one? Let me know what you think in the comments. And make sure you subscribe, because in my next video, we're taking a deep dive into the Belt and Road, exposing how China is using infrastructure to reshape the map of global power.